Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
It emerged that there were reports to the police of screams in the night. There was a young woman who was going to a party at a next-door house on Canning Road. She remembered hearing two loud screams just after 9 o'clock, coming from the direction of Joanna's flat.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this episode, the murder of Joanna Yates, a case that gripped Britain over Christmas 2010. Initially a search for a missing young woman, which turned into a murder case with several suspects in the frame, one of whom, an innocent man, was vilified by the media. We'll explore how police finally exposed the killer's lies, and why media coverage of this case was particularly frenzied, adding to the pressure on police and creating a backlash with compensation awards and increased press scrutiny and regulation. Martin, you were in Bristol for Sky News and saw this investigation unfold firsthand. Tell us a bit about it.
I don't know why, Helen, but so many of the grimmest stories I've covered over the years happen around Christmas. So that year, a few days before Christmas, I found myself in Clifton, which, for those who don't know it, it's a very ritzy, elegant part of Bristol. There was snow on the ground. Dozens of colleagues from other media organisations were already there. I wasn't the first Sky News reporter on the scene. I went up to join our regional correspondent who'd covered it for the first 24 hours or so. But there's an indication there that it was already a story that required two reporters at least to cover it as the story became so high profile. The police were knocking on local doors still, looking for anybody who'd heard or seen anything, appealing to anybody really with any information about this young woman and her movements. A young woman who at that stage was a missing person. She'd vanished from home. And there could have been a variety of reasons for that. But at the time, even in those early hours, I think there was a sense that maybe there had been a crime committed. And police very obviously were becoming very quickly concerned for her safety.
I know Clifton very well. My daughter's at university in that area of Bristol. And you're right, it's a very lovely, safe-feeling, leafy area. But tell us a bit about who Joanna Yates was.
She was 25 years old. She was a landscape architect. To those who knew her, she was lively and very well liked. Her flat at 44 Canning Road, which she shared with her architect boyfriend, Greg Reardon, was in this quiet, leafy suburb of Clifton. They lived in that flat in a large house that was subdivided into a number of apartments.
And how did she disappear, Martin?
It was about 8 o'clock in the evening, 19th of December, 2010, so 6 days before Christmas. Everything was very Christmassy, of course. Her boyfriend Greg had returned home from a weekend visit to Sheffield, to his family up there, to find that Joanna wasn't in the flat. Now, he'd been trying to contact her without success by phone and by text, but he hadn't, for some reason, got through at all. And she had certainly not responded. So he got back to the flat and he called her again, and to his astonishment, her mobile phone rang from a pocket of her coat that was still in the flat. Then he found her purse and her keys also inside the flat. You can imagine how the alarm bells must have been ringing for him. Just after midnight, he called the police and Joanna's parents to report that she was missing.
He must have been so worried when that phone rang in her coat pocket. You can't really imagine the horror and fear of that. And even in Somerset Police, credit to them, they took the call very seriously and launched what turned into a massive search with a police helicopter, sniffer dogs and lots of manpower.
I think we assessed at the time it was probably Avon and Somerset's biggest criminal investigation, and it may still well be. From what we could see, there were cops on the ground. We could see them doing searches, stopping motorists in the roads around Joanna's flat, asking them if they remembered seeing her or anything suspicious around the time that they believed she'd disappeared. There was all that going on, but of course, in these kind of investigations, there's so much more going on in the background. Effectively, detectives would have been pulling apart Joanna's life and her lifestyle, talking to everybody she knew, trying to explore her use of social media. They had her telephone that they could explore, contacting her family and her friends, looking for any explanation for her disappearance. Had she perhaps been taken ill? Had she run off with a secret lover? Had she taken her own life for some unexplained reason? All of those were potential explanations for her disappearance. But of course, what came to loom very large was the idea that she had been abducted.
And what did they establish about what had happened the night that she went missing?
Well, they started to piece together her last known movements. They established quite a lot, actually. She'd spent the evening of the 17th of December, so this is 2 days before Greg, her boyfriend, got back to the flat. The night of the 17th of December, she'd been with colleagues at a pub in Bristol, leaving at around 8 o'clock that evening for what should have been a 30-minute walk home. She was caught on CCTV at around 10 past 8. She was wearing a white winter coat. She was carrying a black bag, and she was seen leaving a Waitrose supermarket, but she hadn't bought anything in there. At about 8:30, she phoned her best friend to arrange to meet on Christmas Eve. The last known footage of Joanna was recorded of her buying a pizza from a branch of Tesco Express. That was around 20 to 9 p.m. She'd also bought 2 small bottles of cider at a nearby off-licence Bargain Booze. After that, there were no more sightings.
So there's 48 hours there that nobody could really account for, and police didn't know where she was or what she was doing. I remember quite well, Martin, the family appealing for help from the public. Such a dreadful thing for anyone to have to do.
I've watched an awful lot of families, loved ones making appeals for missing people, and it's never easy. However much police brief, advise and encourage relatives who have been asked to make an appeal, it must be very difficult, and most of them, in some way, end in tears of despair. On the 21st of December, Joanna's parents and Greg Reardon, the boyfriend, made a first public appeal for her safe return, as they put it, at a police press conference. That was 4 days on from her disappearance, her last sighting, and I suppose it was obvious that they really did fear the worst, but as you would, in the absence of any evidence that she'd come to any harm, you would hope and pray for a happy outcome. Then, in another press conference, a couple of days later, broadcast live by Sky News and the BBC, Joanna's father, David, was asked to comment on her disappearance. And he said this: "I think she was abducted after getting home to her flat. I have no idea of the circumstances of the abduction because of what was left behind. I feel sure she would not have gone out by herself, leaving all those things behind, and that she was taken away somewhere." And I think he put into words what most people were thinking. She'd left her purse, her phone, her keys, her coat. Who leaves home on a cold winter's night without any of those things?
How did Greg and the parents seem at that press conference, Martin?
I think, as I've said before, they were hopeful, they were desperate for information. We don't know at that stage how much the police knew, but I think In those early days, everybody was desperate for any more sightings beyond that time, 8:40 p.m. on the 17th of December. There'd been no sight of her there. And I think, as her father said, they were all coming round to the view that the motive for her disappearance was probably abduction.
So with their coat and phone in the flat and no sign of a forced entry, the police deduced that Joanna must have known her abductor.
I think the circumstances certainly suggested that. Both bottles of cider she'd bought were found in the flat. One of them had been partially drunk, and her coat was there as well, as we said. Oddly, there was no sign of the pizza or the pizza box, and they were never found. And as days went on, police appealed around the pizza and the pizza box. They seemed to think it was quite integral. She clearly got home, and then the question was what had happened next. Then it emerged that there were reports to the police of screams in the night. There was a young woman who was going to a party at a next-door house on Canning Road. She remembered hearing two loud screams just after 9 o'clock, coming from the direction of Joanna's flat. Another neighbour who lived behind Joanna's home said that she too heard a woman's voice scream, and she heard the words "help me," although she couldn't be precise about exactly when she'd heard that. So again, this rather reinforced the idea that Joanna had been abducted against her will.
And cases like this seem even more poignant and sad over the festive period. I know they shouldn't. Perhaps it's the news is often quieter over Christmas. It feels like a time when people should be happy and on holiday. And this case really did dominate news coverage, didn't it?
It did. It was something of a media frenzy almost from the start. Certainly by the time I got there, within 24 hours or so, there were lots of colleagues around, not just around the scene of her disappearance, but all over that area, knocking on doors and asking questions of neighbours and so forth. It was almost from the start not just a local story. It became a national obsession in usually, as you said, a quiet time for news in the run-up to Christmas. Although I have to say, a story about a young woman vanishing into thin air in unexplained circumstances at a traditionally happy time is always going to be big news for journalists.
Then, of course, the dreadful discovery that turned this from a missing persons case into a murder.
Joanna's body was discovered fully clothed on Christmas Day, so 8 days after she was last seen. Her body was near a golf course in Longwood Lane in Fayland, North Somerset. This was across the River Avon. It was 3 miles from her flat. The post-mortem examination revealed manual strangulation, and there were marks on her neck. Her nose was fractured, and there were cuts and bruises on her arms, and all of that suggested quite a violent struggle. I remember around that time, or soon after the discovery of the body, I walked around the scene with a former murder investigator called Rick Turner from the Met Police, somebody I knew very well. Joanna's body was in the verge beside a road, up against a wall, and beyond the wall was a quarry on the other side of the wall. Now, Rick speculated that her killer must be somebody local who'd intended to dump her body over the wall into the quarry, but for some reason perhaps had found it too difficult to lift her, or more likely perhaps that he'd been disturbed, and probably by passing traffic, because although you're heading out towards the countryside, it was a road that was situated soon after the end of the Clifton Bridge. So it was quite a reasonably busy thoroughfare. And I think the idea of somebody, even late at night, thinking that they'd have some time to push a body over a wall into the quarry without being seen by passing motorists, I think it would have been a difficult thing to achieve.
And how awful for her family, Christmas Day, to find out that she's not coming back, but she'd obviously really suffered.
Yes, the trauma, the shock of finding that she wasn't going to be found alive, that she'd been found dead, must have been bad enough. But then to learn the nature of her injuries. And of course, I think all of it rather pointed to a struggle. And who knows how long that struggle had gone on. And the idea that your daughter had been fighting for her life and eventually losing that fight in those terrible circumstances must have been almost unbearable for her family.
So this was now a hunt for a killer. Who were the main suspects?
Those closest to a murder victim are always the first suspects. Most murder victims are killed by somebody they know, even family members. So police understandably initially focused on her boyfriend Greg Reardon. He'd been away for the weekend when she disappeared, but he was soon ruled out. His alibi stood up.
But then again, awful to think that presumably her boyfriend, one of the people in her life who loved her so much and is just dealing with the shock of her murder and the dreadful time she clearly went through being strangled and fighting back, and then he's been questioned by police. All of this just doesn't bear thinking about, but of course it's a natural process that police have to go through, isn't it?
It's not uncommon. Often police find themselves having to deal with somebody who is a suspect and a victim, but they have to ask those vital, very intrusive questions. He was quite quickly removed as a suspect, and indeed he went on with his and Joanna's friends to set up a website asking for any information, and I think they had thousands and thousands of calls and information that was passed to them that was then handed on to the police.
Then police and media attention focused on another man, Christopher Jefferies, Joanna's 65-year-old landlord.
It did, and it was a bizarre twist to this increasingly fascinating story. Christopher Jefferies was a retired schoolteacher with a reclusive, slightly eccentric manner. He was involved in the local neighbourhood watch, and he lived in the flat directly above Joanna's. On the 30th of December, 5 days after her body was found, Jefferies was arrested on suspicion of her murder.
Why was that?
Well, initially, police cited his odd behaviour during questioning and the fact that he'd been seen arguing with Joanna weeks earlier about her compost bin. Now, perhaps that's a sort of discussion, argument even, that landlords do have with their tenants. I'm sure you and I have probably got experience in our younger days of that kind of interaction, so perhaps the police made a lot of it, but it was reported as an argument rather than a discussion. A colleague of mine actually interviewed Christopher Jefferies for Sky News. He was quite reclusive, but my colleague did manage to catch him rather on the hop coming out of his flat one day, and he was a bit vague about certain details of what he'd seen of Joanna in the days around her disappearance. He made it clear that he'd told the police everything that he'd seen, and he actually made it clear to us that he couldn't be sure that he'd seen Joanna, but his story essentially was that he'd seen her, or seen some people leaving her flat that evening, but he couldn't be sure if one of them was Joanna. Anyway, it turned out that he was completely innocent. Forensic teams searched his flat, though there was no physical evidence that tied him to the crime. The media had whipped up suspicion about him. The tabloids seized on Jefferies' mad professor persona, that's how he was described. The Sun branded him a prime suspect, and the Daily Mail published photographs of his cluttered home under headlines like "The Landlord Who Lived Above Her." He was effectively vilified in the press. I can't think, really, that the police arrested him just because some parts of the media were suspicious about him. They must have felt genuine reasons to arrest him and question him, but he was soon ruled out of the investigation.
It's awful to hear, though, isn't it, how the press branded him mad and vilified him like that, because mud sticks and people always feel there's no smoke without fire.
Yes, it was more than hints and nudges. It certainly wouldn't happen today, not least because he eventually sued a number of media outlets and got a lot of money in compensation. Certainly today, the media's had to become much more sensitive around privacy of individuals. And that's partly because of the case of Christopher Jefferies and the treatment he got.
And meanwhile, the noose was tightening around the man who would eventually be charged with Joanna's murder.
Yes, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch architectural engineer. He lived in the third flat in the same building as Joanna and Chris Jefferies. At first, Tabak told police and reporters that he barely knew her, but police noticed inconsistencies. in what he was saying, and they became suspicious of his questions to them about forensic work being done by the police. Now, a little later on, after initially talking to him as somebody who lived close by, the police went to the Netherlands. Over New Year, he'd gone back to visit family, and they went to speak to him there. And that's when his story began to unravel, because forensics took a closer look at him. They found traces of his DNA on Joanna's body and Joanna's DNA in the boot of his car that showed a match with less than a 1 in a billion chance that it wasn't hers. So if, as he said, he barely knew her, and he insisted on that, how could he explain all that away?
And there was also some damning circumstantial evidence that the police managed to find on his computer.
It was damning indeed, yeah. Crucially, his internet history showed searches for topics like the length of time a body takes to decompose. Who normally researches that kind of stuff? There was violent pornography, binding and gagging, women controlled by men, and a particular model who bore a striking resemblance to Joanna Yates. So the case against him really was beginning to mount up.
Give us a sense of the timeline here. When was he charged, and when was that in relation to Joanna's body being found?
So her body was found on Christmas Day. He was arrested on the 20th of January 2011, and then it was another 12 days before he was charged with her murder. So in all, it was about 5 weeks after she went missing that he became a strong enough suspect to charge. And at first he denied everything, but at a pre-trial hearing at the Old Bailey in North London, 4 months later, he pleaded guilty to Yates's manslaughter, although he still denied that he murdered her. And the case had moved to the Old Bailey briefly, I think because the judge who was to take the trial was sitting there temporarily. It was odd because there weren't many reporters in court that day. Everybody assumed that it was just another of what's usually a string of preliminary hearings where nothing much is expected to happen. Now, over the years, I've learned not to assume anything, so I did go along to this case. So it was a couple of 100 miles away from Bristol. For the reasons I've explained, it was held at the Old Bailey. Nobody thought it would be more than a 5-minute hearing. But astonishingly, when the charge was put to him again, he said he denied murder, but he admitted manslaughter. So for the first time, he was admitting that he'd killed her. There was no great detail offered, but I had to sit back and just think for a moment, have I really heard an admission of guilt? I decided that I had. I raced out to report this. This was a huge story. I raced out to my live camera, reported that Vincent Tabak had admitted killing Joanna Yates. And the thing I remember most vividly was as I was coming off air, I looked across the road and my BBC rival was waltzing down the road, swinging her handbag, smiling at me and sort of saying, "Has it started yet? Is anything happening?"
Oh,
and I had to tell her the sad news that, yes, it had very much started. It was all over. He'd admitted manslaughter, at which point she just bolted into the Old Bailey to try and catch up.
Had she been pottering, doing a little bit of shopping or something and missed it?
I think nobody was expecting anything to happen. This was just going to be a run-of-the-mill preliminary hearing, a bit of judicial housekeeping, as they call it. But for some reason, and we had no inkling that this was about to happen, he suddenly popped up and admitted that he'd killed her.
So at the time, Martin, at that pre-trial hearing, when you were suddenly shocked to learn that he'd changed his plea, was any information given at that point as to why he changed his plea?
No, and you really wouldn't expect it to be. Nobody would have wanted to question him in open court because I guess both sides, prosecution and defence, probably wouldn't want the details to be aired before the trial. The essential thing was the prosecution did not accept that plea. They insisted that he had murdered her. And so that clearly wasn't the end of the court proceedings. There was still going to be a murder trial some months later, which indeed there was. By that time, the whole criminal justice process had moved back to Bristol.
And the full trial started in the autumn of 2011, so we're talking about just shy of a year after Joanna's body was found. At that trial, did you then find out why he'd changed his plea from not guilty to manslaughter?
We did eventually, although it took some time for him to explain it. The trial itself was pretty dramatic. This was still a very, very big story. One of my abiding memories, I suppose, is of Joanna's family having to listen to the grim details. And there was a very strong prosecution case against Tabak. One of the grimmest details was that she'd suffered 43 injuries. So you can only imagine the fight she must have put up before she was overcome. Among the stuff that was laid out to the court, the DNA swabs taken from her body had provided a match with Tabak. Samples found behind the knees of her jeans indicated that she may have been held by the legs as she was carried. Fibre transfers suggested contact with Tabak's coat and car. This was all very powerful prosecution evidence against Tabak. There were bloodstains found on that wall overlooking the quarry, close to where she was discovered. In addition, the jury heard how he'd lied to police and media, attempting even to implicate Christopher Jefferies. He'd been fascinated with sexual violence towards women online and then had tried to delete his internet history when he realised that the police were taking an interest in him.
So what was Tabak's defence?
It didn't really add up, and clearly it didn't add up for the jury who convicted him. It was slightly reminiscent of Ian Huntley's defence in the case of the Soham murders, the two little girls who the school caretaker Ian Huntley had murdered. We explored all that in episode 4 about the Soham murders. Tabak waited almost to the last minute in the witness box to give his full version of what he said had happened. He claimed he'd panicked and killed Joanna accidentally. This was his story. He said it wasn't sexually motivated, that Yates had made a flirty comment, as he called it, and invited him in for a drink with her. He said he went to kiss her. She screamed, according to him. He tried to silence her. He said he held his hands over her mouth and around her neck for about 20 seconds, and then she simply died. He told the court that after dumping the body, he was, in his words, in a state of panic.
But the jury didn't believe him.
Would you?
No.
Would anybody believe that story? Suggesting that she had come on to him? It really didn't add up, and in the light of day, it was a terrible thing to try and blame her for what had happened. The jury took just 11 hours to convict him. That's not very long after a long involved trial. And Tabak was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before he'd be eligible for parole. It's chilling to think, I suppose, that he could be asking for permission to be freed in 6 years' time.
And did you get any sense from the prosecution, once he'd pleaded guilty to manslaughter, as to why they pushed for murder? Was there just a really strong feeling that this was premeditated and it was murder as opposed to manslaughter?
I think it was the mounting evidence, and particularly about his character and those internet searches about decomposition of bodies and this deep interest in extreme pornography. All of that and his movements around the time clearly pointed to a premeditated murder, and the prosecution were determined not to be fobbed off by accepting a manslaughter admission, which might have got him just a few years in prison. They were absolutely determined that this was a man who'd set out to kill her. Sexually motivated attack that deserved a very, very long time in prison.
And as you just said, he is still in prison now, isn't he?
Yes, he is. It's difficult to think that he'll really be given parole as soon as he can apply for it. In 2015, he did try to get free. He went to appeal court, claiming that his trial was biased. And again in 2018, he was turned down again for freedom.
And what happened to Christopher Jefferies, Joanna's landlord, who was wrongly accused of being involved?
He was ruled out completely from the investigation about a fortnight after her body was discovered. So for those 2 weeks, he didn't know what the police were going to do with him. He remained under suspicion, but I think once the police focus had very firmly settled on Vincent Tabak, they just decided that Christopher Jefferies hadn't played any role in it. I think at one point there was a suggestion that maybe 2 suspects had been involved in the removal of her body and so forth. But anyway, Christopher Jefferies was firmly ruled out. But for him, of course, in terms of character assassination, media vilification, the damage was done. And it led to legal action. Jefferies sued The Sun, the Daily Mirror and the Mail for libel and won thousands of pounds in damages. And I think there were an awful lot of people who thought he thoroughly deserved it.
And you wonder what ever happened to somebody like that, because, as we said earlier, mud tends to stick, and that may have been very difficult for a long time for him to lead a normal life. And am I right in thinking, Martin, that overall this case was a pretty shocking showing for the media?
I think undoubtedly it was. It exposed some very bad media conduct. The tabloids particularly jumping the gun with suspect names, intruding into innocent people's homes to stoke a story. There was even an episode where an ITN reporter came a cropper, and ITN were banned from police briefings for a time, which was rather ridiculous. It was an overreaction by the police, because to exclude a major broadcaster when you're appealing for information is a ridiculous thing, because who's to know that the one person, perhaps with a vital clue, might be an ITN viewer and would be deprived of knowing that the police wanted that information. Anyway, ITN had interviewed an ex-police officer. They'd taken him to the site where Joanna's body was found, and they'd filmed it and explored this ex-copper walking around. And he essentially accused detectives of missing a paper cup that he found at the scene. Now, the ridiculous thing was that this was some time after her body had been removed, and this was a road where traffic was travelling up and down. That paper cup could have come from anywhere, most likely tossed from a passing car. But ITN made a lot of it, used it to bash up the police, who still hadn't found their suspect, and it resulted in that rather ridiculous ban. But it was soon lifted. The police eventually saw common sense and realised that, along with all the other viewers and newspaper readers, it couldn't do without ITN viewers when it was looking for more information. Some time later, about 2-3 years later, Christopher Jefferies testified at the Leveson inquiry into press standards and ethics, and he argued that newspaper ownership structures prioritise sensationalism over truth. That's how he put it. His ordeal remained a textbook case of how the media can destroy innocent lives. I don't know how he is now. Maybe he's managed to put it all behind him. And I suppose to the vast majority of people, the name Christopher Jefferies won't really mean anything. But to crime reporters like me, and particularly those of us who covered the case, it means an awful lot in the way the press can behave very badly.
And why do you think that the media went so overboard with this particular case?
Do you know, I don't really know. It was a compelling story from the start. An attractive young woman vanishes without trace at Christmas time. You had respectable parents. The whole family was respectable, a distraught boyfriend. And it all happened in a beautiful part of Bristol, not some grubby back street of the city, and there are plenty of those. So the media seized on the story for some very obvious reasons. And I suppose what made it worse for Christopher Jefferies was when there are no obvious suspects, I guess we all look at characters around the area, those nearby, and Christopher Jefferies certainly was a striking figure who knew Joanna, somebody who went out of his way to avoid the media, except for that one comment when my colleague caught him on the hop and managed to get him to talk very briefly about possibly seeing Joanna moving away from the flat that night. But I guess there were some elements of the media that resented the fact that maybe that we'd got the scoop and he hadn't talked to them. The story dominated the news for days, and that, of course, creates extra pressure on reporters to produce more and more stories, more than the normal, especially tabloid newspapers who at the time, and aren't they always, locked in circulation battles, always trying to outdo each other. And sometimes they overstep the mark, and they certainly did in this example. But on the other hand, all media companies have lawyers. Everything I do gets run past the lawyer. You would have thought, perhaps, that those lawyers could have reined in some of that libelous, as it turned out, reporting. So I suppose in a nutshell, I understand why it was such a compelling story. I understand the rivalry and the need to outdo each other as rival reporters, but quite why Christopher Jefferies was so vilified, I think it's difficult to understand. And of course he got his revenge in the very large High Court settlement, but whether that was enough to compensate him for being so vilified, I don't really know.
We've both worn both hats. We've worked for the tabloids. We've also both worked for Sky News and worked in television a long, long time. I always feel that television tries to be a little more careful than perhaps sometimes the tabloids are. What process do you go through? What struck me there was when the pre-trial hearing, when you almost had to do a bit of a double take and think, is that what they've just said? Has he just changed his plea to manslaughter? There's something quite nerve-wracking and adrenaline-fueled, and I've been in this position too, where you're standing outside a court and you're breaking a story or imparting knowledge where you still start to question your own mind. Did I actually hear that? There's quite a pressure, isn't there? And do you put yourself through quite stringent checks to make sure that everything you say is accurate?
I certainly do. When I heard him say guilty to manslaughter, I was tempted just to run out of the door, downstairs across the road, and just go straight live on the telly to impart this great news, big news. But of course I didn't, because I have learned over the years to take a deep breath. And I did turn to a couple of reporters with me and said effectively, did he just say guilty? Because sometimes in a busy court and a big courtroom, sometimes you can mishear guilty for not guilty.
The acoustics always aren't great, are they?
Absolutely. There's not much difference when you're listening from a distance between guilty and not guilty. So I had to double check with a colleague, and yes, they were as gobsmacked as me that he'd admitted the manslaughter. He'd effectively admitted killing Joanna Yates after all these months. But of course, the other thing you have to do is check that there aren't any reporting restrictions. Because although it's been said in open court, particularly at a preliminary hearing where there's a trial looming, you don't want to create contempt of court. And sometimes ongoing criminal justice proceedings have all sorts of restrictions for all sorts of reasons. So I think I certainly asked my fellow reporters, are there any reporting restrictions? And I think I also double-checked with the clerk of the court, and that's the figure that sits just below the judge, who knows all about the processes and the background to the trial. So I must have gone at some stage over to the court clerk just to confirm that there were no reporting restrictions that I wasn't aware of. And as soon as I was told that there weren't, I did then shoot out and go and report it. But I think as a reporter on 24-hour news, you're usually the first out of the traps, aren't you? You're usually the first one to go with it, even if you've all agreed that, yes, you heard that and there are no restrictions. There's still something slightly unnerving about breaking a very big story. It's exciting, but also you do suddenly think, hang on, did I do all the checks that I needed to?
Of course, this case was 15 years ago now. Does your mind ever wander to her family and to her boyfriend and thoughts of what may have happened to them in their lives and how they've managed to try and pick up the pieces after such a dreadful tragedy?
I was thinking that very thought on my way here today, that I wonder what Greg Reardon is up to. Probably married now to somebody else, but I wonder how her murder has coloured his life. Can't for a moment imagine that he can ever forget about her, but has he moved on? Has he got a family now? Her parents, well, I imagine are still consumed with terrible sadness. How can they ever get over something as traumatic as that?
Hey listeners, The True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.